Welcome to Women of the World, a show which shares the vision and the philosophy of the Statue of Liberty. Our goal is to give a voice to women from around the world who have chosen to make the United States their home. Here is Nadia Giordana.
Hello and welcome to Women of the World. I'm Nadia Giordana and I'm here today with Beverly Crosby, and Beverly and I will be talking about our family immigration stories and wherever that takes us, right up to some of the immigration issues that are going on in our country today. Welcome, Beverly.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Immigration is not a new subject. It's, we have stories to tell. So it'll be fun today to talk about our stories and our heritage. Nadia, as my business, part of my business is doing videos and telling stories and family legacies. So this is of particular interest to me because where do you start? You start with your own family. Mm-hmm. And I'm presently doing a family legacy of my mother's side. So, and I know that you also, you come from immigration.
Yeah, my family has a history of immigration also, and I've done the genealogy parts of the family, so it's all going to tie together. And yes. One of the first things I want to hear about is how you use video, because that's something, even though I love doing video, I have not used video in my family's recording of stories. How are you using that? How do you do that?
Right, and that's a really important piece. Not everybody does it. Some people will just write the story out, mm-hmm. which is wonderful. Whichever way you do it, it's important to have some sort of documentation about your family history, even if your children don't seem to be interested at this time. As they get older, they will say, what happened? How did, who was our grandfather? Who was, and it's a very important piece. So it's up to us to document this. What I choose to do, because I have that background as well, is I tell the story with video, but I also use any kind of documentation I can get. And I guess the part that I would start with if I was telling, the viewers to work on something, capture the story of your parents, the elderly people in your family, while they're still here.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
While they can still speak about it.
And while they can still remember.
Exactly, mm-hmm. exactly. So one of the pieces I have is of my mother, and they love talking about years back. Mm-hmm. And so I have several different video clips that I will edit at another time of the stories,
Oh, and of her telling the stories.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
Exactly. Wonderful. And then, but capture that, first of all, because they may not be around.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you can
First things first.
Yes, you can always add to that. You can get documentation. I have documentation of my grandfather's, his residency, their marriage certificate. I have copies of all those documents I've been able to gather. Mm-hmm. And then later on you start putting the story together. But you did ask, how do I use video? Well, they talk about the beginning. They, mm-hmm. And they talk about what they remember from the day one. And then you introduce, as they're speaking, mm-hmm. you maybe show a picture of the documentation of the immigration papers. And then, you bring in some other family members too. There's so many different ways of telling the story.
Oh, that's great. I didn't do it that way. All I did, well, I won't say all I did, it was a lot of work also, but I put together a bunch of books. I ended up with a production line. I did 13 for all of the brothers and sisters and first cousins and grandkids, or whoever it was. I ended up, nieces and nephews, I guess it was, and duplications of the stories that we had recorded, and then the photographs that went with it, and had it all in books. And I made one for each of them. It still wasn't enough because there are younger ones that have come up since then. It's going, what about my book? And I could never start again, but I'll come up with something new and give to them. But it's a lot of work, isn't it?
I was just going to say that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And having the book and the old, gathering all the old photos.
I wish I had some video now. I wish I would have thought of that at the time,
Right.
because that would have been fun.
Right, and that's where, you know, I incorporate the documents, the photographs, sometimes, and I add text to, you know, tell a story if they're not speaking. But even what you did, your family must have really appreciated that.
I'm confident. I've certainly got plenty of thank yous at the time, and I'm glad that I did it. And of course now it involved looking up the old stories too. And going back to your family, your grandfather has an interesting story. What was that story that you were telling me before the show?
And we have to capture this story because it's so fun. It almost sounds like you know, a story that we made up, but it's not. It's the real deal. He was from Bulgaria, and he was in the war.
Where is Bulgaria in relation to the other countries in Europe? Do you?
I believe it's, well,
What's it next to?
we need a map, don't we, to show
Yeah,
people?
it would be nice to have that right
to see where
at
it is
this
from
moment.
Germany. And
Okay, in
close
that area,
in that
of
area
Germany.
over there.
Yeah.
But he was in the war, and at that time, the government did not treat their soldiers very well. They were going without the clothing they needed. They had holes in their shoes. They weren't getting enough food to eat. And my uncle told me this part, because I didn't get the story from my grandfather, but my uncle, his son, told me that my grandfather said, you know, we're going to die. And, you know, we might as well leave because we're going to die out here, or we may have a chance to live. So he and a friend from the service, they got on a boat, a ship back then, and they were called stowaways, but they knew that was their only
So
way
he
of
left
living.
the military.
He left the military.
yeah.
And they got on a ship that came to the States.
There's no going back after that.
They can't go back because if they did, they would probably be shot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they knew they couldn't do that. So it was a huge decision. You know, you're leaving your families, your siblings. They never talked about it. Once they got to the States, the interesting part was that they didn't speak English. They got off this ship and they had to write their names down. Well, they couldn't tell what their name was, because if somebody heard about the real name,
They
would kill
starting
their
a new
families. They
life.
would even shoot the families back in their
Yeah,
country.
sure.
So they didn't dare do that.
Yeah.
They then took on names, and they said, well, pick a name. And so they picked the name Steve. My grandfather picked the name of Steve as the last name, not knowing that's
Not
a
knowing
first name.
it's a first name. That's
And then,
so cute.
And then he picked Mike as
Yeah.
the first name. So his
Yeah.
name was Mike Steve. And of course, my uncles and my cousins are Larry Steve, Mike Steve,
Yeah.
David Steve.
Now it's a family name.
It's a family name.
So did they come through Ellis Island or somewhere else? You mentioned that they came over here and ended up in Minnesota. Do you know how they ended up in Minnesota?
They came to California to start with.
Okay.
And then they must have been sent to maybe Ellis. I'm not sure about that. Good question, though. Something else for me to check into. And but they ended up in Minnesota in the coal mines, because that's where the jobs were. And my grandfather had an accident, and he lost the one part of his leg.
Oh,
And he ended up in a hospital where he met my grandmother. And then they moved to Dubuque, Iowa. To make a long story short, they moved to Dubuque, Iowa, where he became the janitor for the high school. And they ended up having 9 children. And about 22 years after they had been married, he worked at the high school. Immigration said, they said, Mike, you're not married. Your marriage certificate, you know, your wife was not a U.S. citizen. And he said, well, yes, she was. What happened back then was that if a foreigner who came to the States married somebody from the States, the person from the States lost their citizenship. I know.
I never heard that ever.
Yeah. Yeah, they would lose their citizenship. They didn't know it either. So they've been married 22 years, had 9 children, and who would have known?
And it's probably a glitch. It may have been in the laws for a purpose at one point in time. It doesn't seem very useful then, but that's a new one to me.
So my grandmother had to go ahead and study to get her U.S. citizenship all over again. And so they had a piece in the paper. I have a picture of it showing her as getting her citizenship. You know, even though they've been married all those years. Yeah. And then, but my grandfather worked at the high school as a janitor, or the custodian, I think is what they called it back then. And there's an interesting story there. I think we talked about that a little bit beforehand.
I forgot about what the Iowa school story was.
Okay, well, this was actually in Dubuque, Iowa, where they lived. And he was the custodian, and some of the it was a high school, so some of the seniors went to Florida for the spring break. They brought him back a baby alligator, alligator.
Oh, yeah.
So he kept the baby alligator in the boiler room. And nobody could know about it. My uncle says, I remember as a boy going into the boiler room, and he said, I remember hearing this growl noise.
They make noise?
They make noise.
I didn't know they made noise.
He said, I knew the alligator was there because even though it was kind of dark, I knew it was there.
It'd be growing.
My grandfather kept him there for, I think it was 3 years, and he grew to about 6 feet long.
Oh my God.
Nobody knew about it, or at least they didn't let him know that they knew.
Yeah.
And one day it got out, and the police, everybody knew my grandfather, Mike. You know, Mike, you've got to keep him in the room. You can't let him out. You're going to scare the people in our community. So, okay, I'll make sure he doesn't get out again. Don't know how to get out. Well, he got out a second time.
Oh.
And
that was probably the end of the
him.
alligator.
And they said, Mike, you have to let him go. He said, what do you do with the alligator?
In Iowa.
In Iowa. You put him down in the Mississippi River. You let him go, thinking he's going to swim back down to Florida? I don't know. Well, that's what he did. But somebody, fisherman or whatever, all of a sudden saw an alligator in the river. And it was all over the newspapers.
Yeah.
Alligator in the river.
Yeah.
That summer, nobody would go to the beach because it says Mississippi River is infested with alligators. They saw one alligator.
And later on, they probably considered it a hoax.
Well, I mean, it was in the newspaper.
Yeah.
And I think later on, somebody actually caught him, and I think he's in some museum or something now.
You know, you and I have an Iowa connection.
That's right.
And I didn't remember it until we started talking again today, but my family settled in Iowa. And
what part of Iowa was that?
Cedar Rapids and Durant and down through there. My father grew up there.
Okay.
And actually, and as a part of the immigration story, he was part of the post-war troops in Italy.
Okay.
And so he wasn't part of the actual war, but the post-war troops, whatever we had after that. And met my mother at that time. My mother was, backing her story up, she left Slovenia, which was Yugoslavia at that time when she was 15, to go to Nova Gorizia, Italy, which was on the Italian side of the border, to get away from, because the SS soldiers were taking young women and all of the things that were happening during, because that was 3 years before. That was when the war was still going. That's when she left, was when the war was still on. And long story short, the SS soldiers would come to the little towns, knock on the door, and usually my mother and her father was dead. My grandmother and my mother and the kids would flee to the hills. But this time they came and they were home, and of course you just comply with whatever they want. Well, it was an SS soldier, and they would like to take the young ladies to town, and on a night on the town, and there's a whole lot that goes along with that. Well, my mother had to go. As it turned out, and this is kind of a heartwarming story, we're not going to go to the dark side right now, but the other SS soldiers definitely had their way with the young ladies in most of the stories that came back. But the 18-year-old soldier that took my mom needed to keep face. He took her around town, and she had to go. His buddies saw him with the lady that he had captured, or whatever, I don't know what the words they used in that, and he saved face. He took her home completely untouched. And
Amazing.
you know, but it was after that, my mom knew she wouldn't be so lucky the next time. She left home, walked like whatever the 25 miles it was to get to the border, to get to the Italian side of the border, because she had a sister, an older sister that lived there, so she would be free. And that was another thing that happened. She had no papers. You couldn't cross the border. Here she is, 15 years old, and she said, there's nothing else I can do. She had to come back out onto the road, cross the crossing place where all the soldiers were. As luck would have it, and divine intervention, when she started walking towards the gate, a fight broke out amongst I think it was the Italian soldiers that were there, or whatever they were. A fight broke out amongst the soldiers, and they were all totally distracted. She started walking across and got across the border, and she was on the other side, and she said, well, if they shoot me, they shoot me. She said, I'm just going to keep on walking. She kept on walking. They never saw her, never noticed her, and she ended up in Gorizia with her older sister, where a year after that, or some months after that, her sister took her to a dance where the American soldiers were.
Sure.
And a soldier took her out on the dance floor. There was a soldier bothering her, and she was trying to get rid of him. And my father was the soldier that came up with, the story, is this man bothering you?
Okay.
Kind of thing.
Okay.
So that happened between the two of them, and the rest is history, and I'm here because of it.
Amazing.
And
Amazing.
they did eventually marry and come to the United States, but not before he was called back. Before they could get married. He was called back to the States before they could get married, and came back later to get her.
Okay.
And by that time I was there.
Right. Were there a lot of paperwork involved, do you know?
There was paperwork. The reason they sent him back was because too many soldiers were marrying foreign brides.
Okay.
And they didn't want to, and Mom and Dad were planning on marrying.
Okay.
And they had wind of that, so they shipped him back thinking that would be the end of that story. But he did come back.
But he came back with the bride
Months later.
and the baby.
Yes, yes. So I came to the United States with my mother. I was the little baby on her passport picture.
I wonder, looking back, how difficult it was at that time to get immigration papers. I mean, my grandfather, it seemed like there were probably a number of people.
My mother
to the
had
States
trouble
at that
because she
time.
was a displaced person.
Okay.
She had no papers. She had crossed that border with nothing. But as it happened when she did have her sister on the other side and a priest there.
Okay.
The priest knew who my mother was and who my aunt was. The priest had to vouch for her to get her papers. In those days, you could do things like that. Oh. So they worked it out that way. So had there not been the priest, I'm not sure what they would have had to have done.
Sounds like she had a number of divine interventions
Yeah.
in order to make it all happen and for all of it to come together.
Iowa.
In Iowa.
Of all
okay, of all places. What do you know what brought them to Iowa?
Well, my dad's family was there, so his parents were there. They were Iowa farmers, so for him that was home.
That was home.
Yeah.
And that would have been comforting to your mother to come into another family too.
That wasn't too bad for her. They were a nice family. Yeah.
Comforting. I mean, you're leaving.
She left everyone, you know, her mother, her brothers, her sisters, and didn't see any of them for many, many years.
Right.
Because it took, I was 16, I think, or maybe I was younger, in that time frame when they brought my grandmother over here to the United States. And that took multiple attempts at paperwork and paying money and paperwork and paying money, and and they eventually did it. And she was here for 5 years, but it was too hard for her to get Americanized, and she made the decision to go back.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
So, you know.
Well, immigration is not new. It's been, we're all descendants basically of, you know,
our whole country is made up of immigrants and immigration stories, and and of course, we have people here in our country today who've been here since they've been, very similar to my story. I wasn't born here, but I've been here since I was an infant. Heaven knows, if I had to go back to Italy, I'd be a bag lady there because I don't know anybody. But and we did have to prove. We did actually have to go. And I eventually, in my 20s, got a certificate of citizenship. So there was some concrete paperwork. We did have to do that, eventually later. Didn't know for a lot of years. So it would be hard for a person here in this country growing up, having to be moved out of this country, deported. I saw that girl on TV say, I don't know this country. I've never lived in this country. My heart just goes out.
Yes,
to the fear they must be feeling.
Yeah, and you know, and the paperwork, everything that they would have to go through now compared to what
it must be
you
more.
did. Yeah. You know, when you said you were 20, you had to put together some paperwork.
Yeah.
Or even my grandmother, she was able to get a citizenship. You know, but she had to do her homework and fill out the papers and study, but it was still okay.
I remember when my mom got her citizenship too. I still remember her doing that test, and it was very hard.
I think it was 3 months, if I remember correctly. I think it took my grandmother 3 months of studying and making sure. And you know, what if she wouldn't have passed?
You think about that. It's a big test. I suppose you get another opportunity to take it again.
Are these
and you know, I'm not up to speed on what's happening with they call them the dreamers. That phrase is a new one to me. Will they have to, are they going to be given the opportunity to take a citizenship test and go through the paperwork to become citizens before they move them out, or is all that up in the air? Do you know?
You know, I think it changes from, you know, day to day, week to week. We're not sure, you know, what's going to happen. It's still up in the air. You know, I just can't imagine having to go through that in today's world when you've been here for so long. You know, that has to be so difficult. I mean, back then, I think people were fleeing because of the wars in their countries. That made sense. And I suppose there were a number of people that fled from their countries and came over. I think that probably was a more natural thing, and probably more acceptable too.
More acceptable and more part of the way we had the country set up at the time.
Right.
But yeah, so it must be much more complicated now.
Yeah, it sounds like it. But my heart goes out to those people as well. And you know, but you know, as we said, immigration is it's not new.
No,
not by a long shot.
No.
But I would just encourage people, as you did, whether you write a book, you put the photos in the book, write the story down, whether you videotape, get your phone out, folks, you know, even that, you know, just capture some of those wonderful stories. It's amazing what our parents don't talk about.
No.
And some of it they don't want to talk about.
Sometimes they don't, but it's important to draw them out, I think, even some of the sad stories. I do remember my mother saying that there was I think it was a cousin to my grandmother. They lived in France. It was a family of 5. They went to Auschwitz and never came back out. To this day, that's the story. They went to Auschwitz, they never came back. No one wants to talk about it, but at least they've said that much, that there's a whole family, and they were not Jewish.
And explain where they went.
A concentration camp.
The concentration, that's what
Yeah. And that was, those are stories that you want recorded so that your family can at least know what the history was, good and bad and happy and sad, and share it with the kids growing up who won't appreciate it when you first give them the books and the videos. But later on they will.
They do. My own sons have said, ask questions now that they're getting a little bit older too. So, as they get older, they do wonder. And then, the grandkids, and, we just need to we have an opportunity to create something meaningful, something that can be passed on for generations about our families. We have that opportunity to do that. And so it's a very important piece.
That's our job. That's our responsibility.
Yes, it is.
Now as elder females of the families. Is there a word for that? I think there's a word for that. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
A matriarch. Maybe that's it. Well,
But
Beverly,
this has been really interesting.
This has been a fun discussion. I learned some things I didn't know about your history.
And vice versa.
We did know we were both partly from Iowa. We knew that much.
Isn't that amazing?
So,
now we're living in Minnesota, but right.
There's probably another story how we both got here. We'll have to come up. We'll have to talk about that.
Another story.
All right. So thanks again, and thank you all for watching the show here today, Women of the World, and we'll see you next time.
The garden summons my endless toil. There sun and rain forever rule. And I, the steward of the soil, am but last summer's hopeless fool. For now in November the garden is spent. What was green has turned brown, and soon all will turn white. Defiant I sit. But at last I relent, for likely it's going to snow through the night. What a summer it was, ever gentle, never rough. The dark clouds would gather whenever it grew dry, and old Sol would burst through when it had rained just enough. And then not I alone would first smile and then sigh. Could I step inside, lock the back door tight, lie down and sleep the winter away, I'd dream of these gardens all colorfully bright, and would not awaken till April's first day.